the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, January 28th, 2015. On today's show, we'll turn to journalist Marcy Wheeler to examine the implications of Jeffrey Sterling's verdict. Sterling is a former CIA officer convicted on 9 counts of violating the Espionage Act. And Larry Siems joins us in studio to discuss the book he edited, Guantanamo Diary, by Mohamedou Ould Slahi. Slahi's lawyer, Nancy Hollander, will also speak with us about the Guantanamo prisoner. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, Jordan's state television has just announced that the government would free a prisoner in exchange for the release of a pilot that had been captured by Islamic State rebels last month. Jordan will release Sajida al-Rishawi, a woman convicted of being a suicide bomber, in response to an ISIS demand. ISIS had threatened to kill Jordanian pilot Moaz al-Qasasbeh, as well as a Japanese journalist. It is not yet clear if the journalist, Kenji Goto's life, will also be spared. Meanwhile, not far from Jordan, in Lebanon, cross-border hostilities with Israel have set off alarms this morning. The Lebanese group Hezbollah reportedly fired rockets into Israel, killing 2 Israeli soldiers and a Spanish member of the UN peacekeeping force. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to respond swiftly. Well, Courtney, what do you make of Jordan's decision to negotiate with ISIS? European countries have done the same, but the U.S. has always refused.
Well, it seems that the Jordanian government's decision was at least partially motivated by intense pressure from the public, and in particular from al-Qasasbeh's family insisting on his safe return. Since his family began speaking out about the hostage crisis in December, there have been several demonstrations demanding the swap. And I think we're entering a point where the U.S. position of we don't negotiate with terrorists is just not tenable, since that has become increasingly one of the strategies that groups like ISIS are using in their campaign. So, Jordan is one of only 4 Arab countries that's participated in the Syria strikes against ISIS, and there's been some dissension on the ground about that course of action. And so I think that Jordan is really feeling the heat on this one. But we also have to remember that all of this is taking place against the larger backdrop of nuclear negotiations with Iran, the likely reopening of conflict between Lebanon and Israel, and efforts by all the parties involved to really deal with the crisis of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So there are really, I think, much larger issues that are at stake here that aren't being discussed in the conversation around this hostage negotiation.
Mexico's Attorney General has declared the 43 missing students from Ayotzinapa officially dead. The statement comes after months of protests rocked the nation over an incident that, to the Mexican public, symbolizes the worst of state collusion with corrupt police and violent drug gangs. At a press conference yesterday, Mr. Jesus Murillo Caram said, quote, "The evidence allows us to determine that the students were kidnapped, killed, burned, and thrown into the river." The mayor of Iguala, where the students went missing, has been charged with their kidnapping and killing. The Attorney General also made a statement about Mexico's most wanted drug kingpin, El Chapo Guzman, who was captured last year. Members of the U.S. Congress have called for El Chapo's extradition to the U.S., but Mr. Caram said it was a matter of Mexican national sovereignty that he remain in Mexico and face justice. El Chapo had been arrested once before, but managed to escape. Courtney, can the public trust Mexico's political leadership on these issues?
It's pretty doubtful. When we think about the Ayotzinapa case, this is a common tactic by the Mexican government to simply offer up bodies to placate the public and try to shut down the conversation. And we've seen this in the past in Juarez and in other parts of northern Mexico, where the state has failed to protect citizens, or, as is more often the case, they actually are responsible for the deaths of citizens. So we've seen this tactic before. We found the bodies case closed. I think in the case of El Chapo, though, the issue of extradition is really complicated. Certainly the United States, we generally don't allow other countries to try U.S. citizens who have committed crimes in their countries. And so, El Chapo definitely has lots of blood on his hands from Mexican citizens that he should answer for. But I think there's also a concern in Mexico that the prosecution of El Chapo is going to be a farce. We know that the Sinaloa cartel has had ties to the Mexican federal police as well as to the military. And the Sinaloa cartel, even though he was arrested, the Sinaloa cartel is still still doing business, and business is very good. So I think there's a real concern that the Mexican government can't police the Sinaloa cartel because it would effectively mean policing itself. So no, there's not very much confidence, I think, in the Mexican government's ability to deal with these issues.
And finally, the state of Georgia executed an African-American man named Warren Lee Hill last night, who, according to lawyers, suffered from an intellectual disability. The execution took place at 7 p.m. after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to grant a stay, even though Justices Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor said they were in favor of it. The 2003 Supreme Court ruling bars the execution of mentally disabled inmates as unconstitutional, but it left it up to the states to decide on where to draw the line. The state of Georgia has set the highest bar for proof of intellectual disability in the nation. Hill's lawyer, Brian Kammer, hit back at the Supreme Court in its refusal to stay the execution, saying it, quote, unconscionably allowed a grotesque miscarriage of justice to occur in Georgia. Courtney, do you agree with the lawyer's characterization of what happened last night?
Oh, I certainly would agree with that. I mean, we know that this case came up multiple times. Federal judges in Georgia ruled on two separate occasions that that Mr. Hill did meet the criteria for someone who suffered a profound intellectual disability and therefore should not have been subjected to the death penalty, and that was not honored in this case. And so I think it was definitely a miscarriage of justice. But clearly the larger issue here is that we really need to reconsider our death penalty policy altogether, and that we should actually begin to initiate a conversation around abolition of the death penalty. We're one of the few developed countries in the world that continues this practice, and it's just not conscionable. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually rethink death penalty policy, generally speaking,
Right.
And not just the policing of people who are mentally unfit or mentally incompetent or intellectually disabled.
Courtney Morris, thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next time. Courtney Morris is our daily Newsflash guest expert and assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates, as well as on Roku. After 3 days of deliberations, 14 jurors in a federal case concerning the Espionage Act found a guilty verdict against Jeffrey Sterling. The 47-year-old Sterling is a former CIA operator who oversaw an ill-conceived U.S. plan to thwart Iran's nuclear ambitions by planting flawed documents through a Russian double agent. The details of Project Merlin, as it was called, were revealed in a chapter of the book by New York Times reporter James Risen. The Obama administration aggressively pursued the case against Sterling, alleging that he had leaked the plan to Risen. Even Risen refused to testify or confirm that Sterling was his source. Mr. Sterling remained stoic as the verdict was read, while his wife Holly openly sobbed. His sentencing trial will take place this April. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder called the verdict, quote, a just and appropriate outcome. He added, quote, the disclosures placed lives at risk, and they constituted an egregious breach of the public trust by someone who had sworn to uphold it. President Obama has used the Espionage Act to pursue cases against whistleblowers more often than any other president in U.S. history. My guest is Marcy Wheeler. She's a journalist specializing in national security issues, the war on terror, and civil liberties. She has a column on exposedfacts.org called Right to Know, where she's been detailing the case against Sterling. Hi, Marcy.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us. I understand you were in the courtroom during the entire trial. Were you surprised by the verdict yesterday?
I wasn't in there for the entire trial, but I was there for much of it.
And the verdict 2 days ago, I should say.
Yeah. I was Not surprised, I think, that the jury found Sterling guilty of the Espionage Act charges. I think the evidence against him was sketchy, especially for 3 of those charges. But I think that once you started finding him guilty on those charges, I can imagine that some inertia taking over and finding him guilty on all of them. I was particularly surprised they found him guilty of an obstruction charge having to do with him deleting an email sometime in 2006 in which, in 2003, he sent to Ricin a link to a CNN article on Iran's purported nuclear weapons program. And the reason I'm surprised that they found him guilty of that is because there was no action that purportedly happened in Virginia, none at all. And yet, so it shouldn't have been charged in Virginia. It might well be a fine charge for him in Missouri, but I'm baffled, frankly, at how they found him guilty of doing that in Virginia. And so it sort of suggests that the jury's understanding of their instructions might be a little bit dodgy.
Now, was there any hard evidence linking Sterling to the leak of this project, or was it, as many reports have suggested, entirely circumstantial evidence?
It was entirely circumstantial. There were 57 phone calls between Ricin and Sterling, and importantly, only 7 of those were before Ricin first tried to publish a story in the New York Times, and that only lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. So, and Sterling was found guilty on 3 charges tied to that New York Times article. So be careful of what you do in 4 minutes and 11 seconds of phone calls, because it could send you to prison for 30 years.
Wow.
There was that CNN article, the link to the CNN article. There was evidence that Ricin quoted from Sterling's performance review in his book. Now, Sterling had an unclassified copy of that, so he could well have shared that with Ricin completely legally. The prosecution argued, I guess compellingly to the jury, that James Ricin, one of the best investigative journalists out there, couldn't have figured out who the performance review referred to on his own, talking to his many CIA sources. So it was a lot of things like that. It was clear that, and mostly the government argued that Sterling knew the information, although I think there are actually holes in that claim. They argued that Sterling had a motive, which was revenge, because the CIA, among other things, had declared those same performance reviews state secrets and preventing Sterling from suing the CIA for employment discrimination because he's African American, and that he had those conversations with Ricin, and therefore he had a means to convey that information to Ricin.
Now, what do you make of Holder's assertions that the disclosures placed lives at risk? Didn't this operation, which even just the sound of it is just bizarre, didn't it take place many years ago?
Took place in 2000, yeah. And it's all the more absurd. The evidence that they submitted to substantiate that claim was Condi Rice, right? The architect with her mushroom clouds, the architect of the Iraq War that has killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, going and relaying the claims she made on April 30th, 2003 to the New York Times, saying, well, millions of people could be at risk because if Iran gets a nuclear program, then they'll blow us all up. I mean, so that you know, it was Condi Rice and her mushroom cloud bombs again making that argument, and apparently it still resonates because I mean, the other life that was at risk allegedly was the Russian scientist who dealt these blueprints to Iran. But what's nutty about that is the exhibits in the case make it very clear that he was writing to Iran using his own name, using his own email record. In fact, the record shows that for about 8 months of this operation, he was using the email that he shared with his wife and kids. So he was like trying to set up fake nuclear deals on an AOL account that he shared with his wife and children. And the CIA claims this was closely held. And I mean, you know, the record shows that if Russia or Iran wanted to know who this nuclear scientist was, they had all the means of doing it because CIA's operational security on this operation was abysmal.
Now, Is Jeffrey Sterling a whistleblower? We know that Edward Snowden, for example, it's easy to classify him as one because he has, first of all, openly admitted that he leaked information from the National Security Agency spy program and has made a convincing moral case for why he did such a thing. Is Jeffrey Sterling also a whistleblower?
Well, one of the things that Sterling, there is abundant evidence of Sterling doing is going through proper channels. I mean, he went to the Senate Intelligence Committee just as the Iraq War was being drummed up for nuclear weapons and said, look, you know, there's this program and I don't know what happened with it, but it seems kind of stupid and I'm worried about us having helped Iran get nukes. The question is, if you believe that Sterling was Rison's source and only source, then it comes down to whether this was a crazy operation or not. And it's funny because Walter Pincus was out with an article this morning saying, oh, in fact, the evidence in the case showed that it was a serious and respectable program. And no offense to Walter Pincus, but he wasn't in that trial. And in fact, the record shows that some of the witnesses, their testimony didn't match up with what the CIA wrote down contemporaneously. It showed that not just the Russian that we know about, but another Russian engineer seems to have had problems with the blueprints. It shows that the operational operational security that CIA was using was crazy. I mean, you know, the notion, it shows that 90 people knew about this operation. I mean, so it actually, in many ways, makes the operation look worse than James Risen made it look in his book in 2006.
How much of this trial was a way for the CIA to save face on this ludicrous-sounding operation?
Oh, absolutely, and to get a scalp. I mean, it's increasingly clear that the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office is not about serving justice. It's about delivering up bodies for the CIA for their revenge tactic. There's the John Kiriakou trial.
Right.
This is the same U.S. Attorney's Office that couldn't find a way to indict anybody on torture charges in spite of abundant evidence that the CIA officers went well beyond the okays that DOJ had given them. So, you know, I think with this prosecution and indeed the way in which the FBI kind of partially investigated it, they never got the records of the other people at CIA who were involved in this operation and therefore couldn't rule out these other people as potential sources for Rison. And so, you know, it's a partial investigation. They end up going after the guy who's been making trouble for CIA. They end up using evidence that they previously have called state secrets. And yeah, they get 9 convictions and, you know, up to, it won't be 100 years, but up to 100 years in prison for Sterling to hide what was, you know, whether you think it was a smart operation or not, it was badly executed. And it's revenge, and it's a warning to other potential leakers. People in DC ought to be a lot more worried about this prosecution than I think they know, because, you know, like I said, Sterling was found guilty of causing James Rison to write a 2003 article based on 4 minutes of phone calls.
Wow. So the case that they made against Jeffrey Sterling was based on this idea that he had attempted to file a suit against the CIA on racial discrimination, but because the CIA couldn't discuss openly his work records because it was somehow a matter of national security, that Sterling took revenge. And this word disgruntled, I understand, came up many times. Federal prosecutor Eric Olshan told the jury that Sterling, quote, felt he had been mistreated, he was angry, he was bitter, he was done keeping the CIA's secrets. He also said the defendant put his own selfishness and own vindictiveness ahead of the American people. For what? He hated the CIA and he wanted to settle the score. What do you make of this language?
Well, I think that Sterling was very angry at CIA. I mean, not much is true. One of the things that the prosecution was very successful at doing through prior protection agreements was keeping out almost all discussion of why it was perfectly rational for Sterling or any number of other people to worry about this operation in 2003, as the CIA had just trumped up a nuclear case against Iraq. You know, with the distance, it makes so much sense that people would be worried, not just that the CIA had helped Iran get nukes, but also that the CIA was dealing deceptive documents that made it look like Iran was pursuing a nuclear program at a time when deceptive documents that made it look like Iraq was trying to pursue nukes. You know, it seems all the more important for Ricin to have published this. So, you know, last I checked, there is not a statute against hating the CIA. But that's, you know, that's where we're at. Hating the CIA and going through proper channels to raise concerns now may get you 100 years in prison.
Wow. Now, the Obama administration, as I'd mentioned, is going very aggressively towards you know, anybody who is potentially leaking what is considered state secrets, anything that they claim can be jeopardizing national security. Was Jeffrey Sterling essentially someone that they were able to make an example of?
Oh, absolutely. And importantly, the Obama administration is not just going after people for leaking secrets. The intelligence community is now going after people for talking to journalists.
Right.
And as I said, the evidence against that Sterling had leaked to James Ricin in time for that 2003 article is especially weak. I mean, you know, we can argue about whether he was involved in the book, but the evidence that he caused Ricin, they use this language a lot, that Jeffrey Sterling turned James Ricin into his puppet to write this article for the New York Times is really sketchy. And so, you know, the government has succeeded in getting guilty verdicts amounting to up to 30 years in prison for 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a phone call.
And the Espionage Act, we should really make clear, has a sordid history. You know, the Rosenbergs were tried under this. This is an act that was crafted in a way to root out dissent, even if it has this veneer of it really being about spying.
Right, and again, when you look at what the Eastern District of Virginia has been doing against people, it's Jeffrey Sterling and John Kiriakou who face prison. It's not the torturers. It's not the people spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's none of those people who more fundamentally are threatening our government. It's the people who violate or allegedly violate CIA's omerta.
There was, I understand, in this very public trial, which was a bit unusual considering that it was regarding the CIA and all these state secrets. There was a bit of political theater with these CIA agents who were supposedly undercover agents being brought in and testifying behind gray walls that had been erected. Can you describe a little of what the courtroom looked and felt like and what that meant?
You know, so there were, I think, 7, 8, 9 CIA witnesses that the CIA claims is still undercover, dubiously in some cases. Some are former CIA, some are contractors with Booz Allen Hamilton, some are still at the CIA. So they would be brought in, they'd testify under their first name, last initial. And it was interesting because that meant those of us in the courtroom, the jury could see them, but we could not. And their language then became all the more important. So whereas there was a Senate staffer who testified, and she got all blinky when she started on cross-examination. In this case, one of the CIA's witnesses, when he started looking at the language of Ricin's book, started sighing heavily and no longer offering yes or no questions. And the judge had to inform him on several occasions, no, you can't just say, mm-hmm, you have to say yes or no. And it became very clear that when he started being asked questions about Ricin's book, that all of a sudden he became less sure of his answers. The other thing that the government did, which was even more repulsive in some ways, was they had found 3 documents in Sterling's home, 4 documents in Sterling's home. One was a performance review from when he was a trainee. The other 3, they showed to the CIA's litigation manager, basically the person who denies all of our FOIAs, and said, well, was this originally improperly classified? Yes, she said, Martha Lutz. Is it now properly classified at secret? Yes, said Martha Lutz. So in other words, right there in the courtroom, she seemed to be saying they had retroactively reclassified these 3 documents as secret. And then having done that, the government handed out these 3 documents to the jury. And it wasn't until cross-examination that we in the audience learned that these 3 documents, which are supposedly secret, date to 1987. And they provide instructions on how CIA officers are supposed to dial rotary phones to get into the CIA. So in other words, CIA, DOJ partly convicted Jeffrey Sterling based on their claim that how to use a rotary phone is a secret that endangers the United States. That's the kind of absurdity that they engaged in.
Wow. Now, of course, a big part of this whole story, even if it wasn't part of the case and the trial as it finally played out, was the DOJ's pressuring of James Risen to testify. He maintained that he would refuse to testify, and of course, if he had been forced and refused, would have faced contempt of court and possible prison time. Eventually, right before I understand this trial went forward, the DOJ dropped its pressure, dropped its requirement for him to testify. First, why do you think it did that? And second, was that a result of public pressure? Because many journalists understandably freaked out at what they saw was happening to their colleague.
Right. DOJ dropped this because Eric Holder is trying to bolster his legacy. When James Cole, former Deputy Attorney General, when they seized 20 phone lines of phone records from the Associated Press in pursuit of another CIA source, when they called James Rosen, a Fox reporter, an unindicted co-conspirator, they caught a lot of crap from the journalists, rightly so, from the press community. I mean, you know, the AP records in particular, the DOJ burned 100 AP reporter sources in order to get what information that it turns out they already had. The guy that is in prison for that leak, he's not the main source of the leak, but the guy that, again, is the scapegoat for that leak. DOJ already had his hard drive in possession. They already had evidence that he had classified information at home. And rather than going after it in that direction, they went after the AP. And I think Holder finally realized that he had gone way beyond what was appropriate to go after journalists. So they dropped Risen's testimony. And all of a sudden, in the courtroom, Risen became no longer this aggressive investigative journalist. He became a mere, as I said, a puppet for Jeffrey Sterling. I mean, the charges were described as not providing Risen information, but for the charges were based on Sterling causing Risen to publish the book chapter or try to publish the New York Times story. And therefore, you know, Risen went from being the key witness in this case to becoming a mere vehicle for Jeffrey Sterling in, you know, a day's time.
Wow. Finally, the sentencing hearing is in April. You mentioned all of these charges together could carry, you know, 100 years of sentencing. What is expected? Is there a sense of how long Mr. Sterling could be in prison?
I have no idea. And his defense attorneys have said they're going to try and set aside the verdict. I mean, they rightly point out that the evidence doesn't support all of these charges. But if that conviction stands on all nine charges, he's 37. So even if you take a third of the potential sentence, which is close to what Chelsea Manning is looking at, then he really faces much of the rest of his life in prison.
Wow. He is currently free and...
Sorry, he's 47, Jeffrey Sterling.
47.
I apologize to him.
And so he is currently free, and it'll remain to be seen what happens in April. Marcy Wheeler, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and helping shed some light on this issue.
Thanks for having me.
My guest, Marcy Wheeler, is a journalist specializing in national security issues, the war on terror, and civil liberties. She has a column on exposedfacts.org called Right to Know, where she's been writing about the case against Jeffrey Sterling. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at a Guantanamo prisoner named Mohamedou Ould Slahi and the book that he has just managed to publish after many years. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. It has been 13 and a half years since Mohamedou Ould Slahi, a Mauritanian national, has been in U.S. custody. Much of his detention has been at the U.S.-run prison camp in Guantanamo, Cuba. Mr. Slahi was first picked up by Mauritanian police just months after the September 11th terrorist attacks. He was then transferred to CIA custody, where, after a brief stay in Bagram prison in Afghanistan, he was flown to Guantanamo. Slahi was subjected to a special interrogation plan tailored to him and personally signed off by Bush-era Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. The interrogation amounted to torture. Even though a judge ordered his release nearly 5 years ago, the Obama administration has appealed that order, and Slahi remains in custody indefinitely. For years, his only outlet was to write about his ordeal. Now, a book based on his writings called Guantanamo Diary has been published. It was held up by authorities for years, and after the government made heavy redactions, the book finally made it to the rest of the world. Joining me in studio today is Larry Siems. He served for many years as the director of Freedom to Write programs for the writers' advocacy organization PEN in both Los Angeles and New York. He's also the author of 2 books, Between the Lines, Letters Between Undocumented Mexican and Central American Immigrants and Their Families and Friends, and The Torture Report, What the Documents Say About America's Post-9/11 Torture Program. He's also the editor of Guantanamo Diary by Mohamedou Ould Slahi. And also with us is Nancy Hollander, an internationally recognized criminal defense lawyer. She represents 2 prisoners at Guantanamo, including Mr. Slahi. She's also the lead counsel for Chelsea Manning on appeal, and she's also served in the past as the president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I'm very pleased to welcome you both into our studio today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first let's talk about the fact that this story is really heartbreaking. When we get to know through the writings of a person, a real person, who is one of many hundreds who has been over the years kept in Guantanamo, it takes on a different tone to, I think, the American public. Can you first tell us, Nancy, since you're representing him, why he has been picked up in the first place? Was he in any way connected to the September 11th attacks, as far as you know?
He was not connected to September 11th in any way, and the government has admitted now that he probably didn't even know about September 11th. He was picked up originally because he was in Montreal and arrived there shortly after a man named Ahmed Ressam left, and Ressam was known as the Millennium Bomber. And so everyone who had prayed at that mosque came under suspicion, and Mohamedou was one of those people. They found out pretty quickly that he wasn't involved in that either. So there's never been any reason to keep him, and he ought to go home.
Wasn't he implicated in something called the Millennium Plot? At least that's what the U.S. government thought.
Well, the Millennium Plot was this plot to blow up LAX, but he had nothing to do with it, and the man who was convicted of it actually talked about 150 other people, and he specifically said he did not know Slahi. So Mohamedou, the government learned pretty early on that he had nothing to do with that plot.
But he was a member of Al-Qaeda at some point in the early 90s.
He joined the Afghanis who were fighting against the communist government in Afghanistan in the early 90s, at the same time that the United States was supporting that effort very actively, and it's not a secret anymore that the United States provided millions of dollars in funds and armaments. So that was very different from the Al-Qaeda that came and focused on the West in the United States. And the judge in 2010, when he granted Mohamedou's habeas petition and ordered him released, specifically said it was a different Al-Qaeda. So that's not a reason to keep him. There is no reason to keep him. He's an innocent man.
So, Larry, let's talk about this book and the journey that this book has taken. Now, I understand that the book was actually written 10 years ago?
It was.
The original manuscript that you worked from?
Right. Mohamedou wrote this book in 2005, beginning in the spring of 2005, just before he was finally allowed to meet Nancy and Sylvia Royce, one of his other attorneys. And he prepared some pages for them in a notebook and handed them to them to sort of introduce himself and his case. And then he just sort of started building that into a book. And so through the summer of 2005 and into September, he wrote what became a 466-page handwritten manuscript in English, his fourth language. Like all materials that are generated by Guantanamo prisoners, everything they say, it was deemed classified from the minute it was created. His attorneys had to turn it over to the U.S. government, which locked it away in a facility inside of Washington. And I'm sure Nancy can explain, they spent 7 years litigating and negotiating to get that manuscript released. Now, I saw the manuscript for the first time in the summer of 2012. I knew there was a manuscript because in 2005, in December, Mohamedou appeared before the Administrative Review Board in Guantanamo. And it's one of two documents that had been declassified in this massive declassification that came about through Freedom of Information Act litigation from the American Civil Liberties Union and through Associated Press Freedom of Information Act action. And these transcripts had Mohamedou's voice for the first time, and you heard a voice that was engaging and funny and humane and honest and very willing to talk about his story. And he tells the presiding authorities at one point, I've written a book about all of this. They sent it to Washington. It's waiting to be cleared. As soon as it's cleared, you should read it. It's a very interesting book, I think. And it took 12 years for that book actually to make it into the public realm.
I want to mention that my guests, Larry Siems and Nancy Hollander, are going to be speaking for our audience in Los Angeles at 7:15 p.m. this evening as part of the LA Library Aloud series at the Mark Taper Auditorium, Central Library. They'll be in conversation with Professor Erwin Chemerinsky of UC Irvine, and there's going to be a dramatic reading by Reza Safai. So Nancy, President Obama has said that he wants to shut down Guantanamo. Wouldn't the release of Mr. Slahi contribute to the shutting down of Guantanamo? Why, in your mind, is the Obama administration appealing his release, even though he's been cleared?
Well, the Obama administration has appealed many of the releases that have been granted by the district court. That's been part of their plan, and in fact, the Obama administration's Justice Department worked very hard to convince the Court of Appeals to loosen their standards, the legal and evidentiary standards, so that it made it more difficult for the prisoners to actually maintain the victories that they'd won in the district court. And of course it makes no sense. The government, the military could stop right now. And we have a petition actually at the ACLU that people can sign to the Department of Defense saying just stop fighting this. Obama told us in 2009 that he wanted to close Guantanamo, and yet his administration continues to fight these habeas releases, and it's one of the first and best things they could do. They could also release all the people who've been cleared for release for many years, and that would get down to a very small number, and the administration needs to move quickly and close Guantanamo.
Larry, I'm wondering if you can read a little bit from this book that you edited. It was remarkable to me that Mr. Slahi, given everything that he had been through, even up until 2005, which was horrific, still maintained this very human voice and a sense of humor. He's sarcastic, he's funny, he even has pop culture references in his jokes.
Well, I think it is what makes this book astonishing. I mean, I knew by the time I got the manuscript what his story was and the kind of shocking ordeal that he had been through, but I never expected this voice. And I think, his is really the voice that in some ways we all needed to hear right now, because you think of Guantanamo as a place that's set up to dehumanize, to deny the humanity of those who are held there, and to and to make it difficult for us to even understand the humanity of the captors themselves, our own brothers and sisters who are serving there. And this book just recaptures all of that and delivers it back to us. I'll read a passage toward the end of the book. It gives you a little sense of his relationships that he develops with guards. The guards call him Pillow. That's his nickname, and they call him Pillow because it is the first thing that he's given, the first comfort item that he receives after this year of horrible deprivation. So that becomes his nickname. My job is to help your rehabilitation, one of my guards told me in the summer of 2004. The government realized that I was deeply injured and needed some real rehab. From the moment he started to work as my guard in July 2004, redacted, related to me right. In fact, he hardly talked to anybody beside me. He used to put his mattress right in front of my cell door, and we started to talk about all kinds of topics like old friends. We talked about history, culture, politics, religion, women, everything but current events. The guards were taught that I was a detainee who would try to outsmart them and learn current events from them, but the guards are my witnesses. I didn't try to outsmart anybody, nor was I interested in current events at the time, because they only made me sick. Before Redacted left, he brought me a couple of souvenirs, and with Redacted and Redacted, dedicated a copy of Steve Martin's The Pleasure of My Company to me. Redacted wrote, "Pillow, over the past 10 months, I have gotten to know you and we have become friends. I wish you good luck, and I am sure I will think of you often. Take good care of yourself." Redacted wrote, "Pillow, good luck with your situation. Just remember, Allah always has a plan. I hope you think of us as more than just guards. I think we all became friends." Redacted wrote, 19 April 2005, "Pillow, for the past 10 months I have done my damnedest to maintain a detainee-guard relationship. At times I have failed. It is almost impossible not to like a character like yourself. Keep your faith. I am sure it will guide you in the right direction." I used to debate faith with one of my new guards. Redacted was raised as a conservative Catholic. He was not really religious, but I could tell he was his family's boy. I kept trying to convince him that the existence of God was a logical necessity. "I don't believe in anything unless I see it," he told me. "After you've seen something, you don't need to believe it," I responded. "For instance, if I tell you I have a cold Pepsi in my fridge, either you believe it or you don't. But after seeing it, you know, and you don't need to believe me." Personally, I do have faith, and I picture him and these other guards as good friends if we would meet under different circumstances. May God guide them and help them make the right choices in life.
So that's the voice of Mohamedou Ould Slahi, and I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners and our viewers the process by which you had to edit his words, because unlike a traditional author-editor relationship where you go back and forth, you make suggested edits, the author comes back and says yes or no, you weren't able to do that because it just took so many years for lawyers like Nancy to get this book out there. So he had to place tremendous faith in you, someone he has probably never met, right?
Absolutely, and it was an incredible gift. His trust was an incredible gift for me, I have to say. But the circumstances of doing this were, as you say, extremely bizarre. I did formally petition to meet with Mohamedou when we were doing the editing process. When I completed a draft, I think it's a basic right of any writer to have a say over the final version of his words as they appear in print, but I was denied the same way that every single writer and journalist has been denied access to prisoners in Guantanamo. To this day, no journalist or writer has ever spoken with a Guantanamo prisoner. Yeah. They do this, they cite the Geneva Convention's prohibition on making prisoners quote-unquote public curiosities, which is, I think, galling and absurd considering the way he was systematically denied Geneva Convention's protections. So all I had to work with was this incredible manuscript that he had written in his cell, and his voice is so clear. He has all of the gifts of a great writer. He has a tremendous eye for detail. He has, he remembers and experiences things through all of his senses. He smells things, he tastes things. He has an incredible eye for dialogue. He's a beautiful, a really moving sense of beauty, just a great aesthetic sense, and a fantastic sense of humor and a great sense of irony. And so all of those things come through. And for me, it was just I had a diamond, that just needed some polishing and a little bit of reshaping, because he started his story at the moment he is put on a rendition flight from Jordan to Afghanistan, and writes up to the present, and then sort of goes back and does a couple earlier beginnings to sort of describe the first part of this really incredible odyssey.
So you improve the chronology.
So the chronology has changed a little bit, but again, it was mostly, polishing the language of somebody for whom English is his fourth language, right, and drawing out this incredible voice.
Nancy, this man went through, and probably very typical of what others in Guantanamo have gone through, horrific treatment. And of course, U.S. officials like to call it interrogation. Some in our mainstream media call them harsh interrogation techniques. What do you call what Slahi went through? Why was there a special interrogation plan that Rumsfeld personally signed off, and what did that plan entail?
Well, that plan was torture. the Secretary of Defense picked two people, and both of them, Mohamedou was one of them, and they received, a man named Katani was the other, they received the worst treatment of anyone in Guantanamo. At that time, the FBI was pushed aside. They were doing what they usually do, which is rapport building, and the military came in and said, you're not moving fast enough. We're not getting the information we want. And so they had this horrible list, and this is where it comes from. It goes, by the way, from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib, probably to the black sites, but it starts there in Guantanamo. And it involved isolation. It involves severe sleep deprivation. So he was up for 20 hours a day being continuously interrogated and only allowed to sleep a couple hours every night. And this went on for over 70 days until he literally started hearing voices, because that will make you crazy. They beat him. We have proof from his medical records that they broke his ribs. They took him out on a boat and led him to believe that they were going to execute him. And he talks about all of this in the book. They kept him in a very cold cell. Then they would keep him in a very warm cell. They brought a fake letter that they said was from the White House saying that they were going to arrest his mother, that they had actually arrested her and were bringing her to Guantanamo, where how would she fare with these men, implying that she would be raped. And we know all of this is true now, everything he talks about, because there were 3 separate investigations: the Senate Armed Services Committee investigation, the FBI investigation, the Justice Department investigation, that describe these interrogation techniques. And he describes them. So what you get from this book is how it felt from the victim. And he was the victim. And, you know, it's not like someone can say now he made it up, because we've admitted it all. In fact, one thing that's really significant is the FBI did an investigation because they were complaining. The FBI agents were saying, we're not doing this. Why are we getting blamed for it? And it turned out that there were members of the military who were pretending to be FBI agents. So
Wow.
the FBI would get the blame. And this is all in a public report. So what happened to him was the worst that happened. And of course, he never told them anything.
Was he sexually assaulted?
He was, in the sense that he's a very religious Muslim man. And they had women come in and take off parts of their clothing, touch each other, touch him, just attempts to humiliate him. Their theory evidently being, if we beat him up, he'll talk to us. If we humiliate him, he'll talk to us. If we terrorize him, which they did, he'll talk to us. And so he did start talking, but all he did was answer yes. And they even say, and he says it in the book, that one of the interrogators said, well, we know what you did. We just want you to admit it. So they would lay it out for him. For example, and he talks about this in the book, they said, we know you planned to blow up the tower in Toronto, Canada. And he describes that he didn't even know there was a tower. But they said that, and he said, yes, you're right, I did. And here are the people who were going to do it with me. So he never gave them any information because he had nothing to give them. He just said yes to whatever they asked him.
Larry, in terms of the book and the process of putting it together, was it a deliberate choice to leave in the redactions? You could have edited around them for a better flow. Why did you choose to have the blacked out parts of the book? And even as you were reading, of course, names were redacted, but you could have made up names.
I mean, you know, I really didn't have a choice. This is the manuscript that the government released, and, you know, the redactions had to be in the manuscript. I think
in some cases whole pages, like there's like 2 words on a page that
exactly.
You can read.
I mean, I think at the same time, I think, you know, editorially speaking and in terms of what this book is about, I think it's important to see those redactions. I think they're the fingerprints of an incredibly intense censorship regime that is Guantanamo. I mean, that, you know, this is one way to talk about this, the Guantanamo story and the prisoner abuse story, is to talk about it in terms of censorship. You create a secret space specifically in order for torture to happen. You maintain that secret space to hide the fact that it happened and protect those who carried it out. And and you also, one of the things that secrecy really serves to do is, make it impossible to recognize the humanity of the people who are behind that curtain. Right. And I think for me, one of the most amazing things about this book is, even despite all of these redactions, which are really in our face evidence of this brick wall that's been built around the men in Guantanamo, but is how in those pages emerge full human beings, not only prisoners, but also guards, the interrogators, the guards. And I think for me, when I first opened this book and I first started reading it, the most amazing thing was, for the first time, I could see myself in this story. I could see people who are like me. I could understand what it would be like to be a guard there. You talk about torture dehumanizes the torture. Obviously, you must dehumanize a person in order to do that to somebody. But we know from years of study about torture that it dehumanizes and degrades the torturer too. And there's just such vivid portraits of the burden that we've put on men. Think of the women who we've sent into an interrogation cell, asking them to take off their uniform tops and sexually abuse. Those women are probably now living lives in the United States and have to carry that. I think this book really opens a window on ourselves, and it's one that's it's very damning in some ways, but it's also in some ways very redemptive, because there are kindnesses, there are gestures of real warmth and mutual curiosity. And you put people, and you say they're the bitterest enemies, and you put them in a room together, and through time, as human beings, they will forge bonds. They will recognize each other as human beings. And I think that's the process that this book shows, and that process should be an example to all of us in terms of how we move forward in this.
I want to quote from near the end of his book, where Mohamedou Ould Slahi asks, "What do the American people think? I'm eager to know. I would like to believe the majority of Americans want to see justice done, and they're not interested in financing the detention of innocent people. I know there's a small extremist minority that believes that everybody in this Cuban prison is evil and that we're treated better than we deserve, but this opinion has no basis but ignorance. I am amazed that somebody can build such an incriminating opinion about people he or she doesn't even know." Does Mr. Slahi have any idea or sense or inkling of how Americans understand Guantanamo? Do they know that we know they're being tortured?
Well, this book will make sure we know. And Mohamedou knows that this book is going out all over the world. It's very hard to communicate, even as lawyers, with him. In order to meet with him, we have to go there. We don't get phone calls. If our lawyers are watching this program, they're used to being able to call a prisoner, their clients call, or federal prisoners have email. We have none of that. We have to go visit him, which is a long and expensive journey and a difficult journey for the lawyers, in order to sit down and meet with him. And we will. One of his lawyers, Linda Marino, is going in February. Teresa was there in January. I'll go in April. We go every few months. But he does know that his book is out.
So the question then, the follow-up to that is, from his perspective, if he knows that Americans know what's being done to them, how does he view our silence, that we allow this to continue?
Well, I think you have to read the book to know how he views it. I mean, that's where the answer is. And even though this book was written 10 years ago, it's really the present, because every day is the same for him. He's in the same prison cell. And at the very end of the book, there's an afterword, which was written just last year, where he said, I'd like to sit down and have a cup of tea with these people who have basically become my family. And he does know that the American people know about it and that the world knows about it. There's no way that he would not know that. But the point is, we need to do something about it. And we need to stand up and tell the government and tell the military and tell the president that Guantanamo has to close, that Mohamedou and all the other prisoners who are not being tried need to go home. And those that are being tried should be tried in a real court, in a federal court. This is America. We don't have these fake, made-up courts.
And is there a legal case to build against Donald Rumsfeld if his signature is on that order?
Well, the United States is a signatory to a treaty called the Convention Against Torture. And that treaty requires that countries pursue and prosecute torturers and that they provide damages to those who are tortured. We have done neither. And of course, we should do both.
Last thoughts, Larry?
Well, I think this book is a tremendous gesture of faith on Mohamedou's part in the power of writing, in the power of truth, and I think ultimately in the American people. The passage that you just read, he says, "I want to know what you think." But he really, I think, deeply believes that if the American people know the truth of what happened, understand the human cost of what we're talking about, that we will make the right decisions. And I think Nancy's right. This is on us.
The onus is now on us.
We talk about why hasn't Obama closed Guantanamo? Well, Obama hasn't closed Guantanamo partly because the Senate Republicans now say, you can't close Guantanamo.
But it's not true. If he's fighting these appeals.
But at the same time, I think, even people in Congress are not courageous, but they're not courageous because they think if they vote to close Guantanamo, they'll be voted out of office, So it is on us. Yeah. It is up to the American people to read this book, to hear it, and to do something about it.
Well, I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good luck at your event this evening. And again, for our LA audience, my guests Larry Siems and Nancy Hollander will be speaking at 7:15 p.m. as part of the LA Library Aloud series at the Mark Taper Auditorium Central Library in conversation with Professor Erwin Chemerinsky of UC Irvine. Thanks so much.
Thank you
so
much.
My guest Larry Siems has edited Guantanamo Diary. Nancy Hollander represents the book's author, Mohamedou Ould Slahi. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Bus is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. And Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kulhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.